I have to say, I feel slightly uncomfortable both with the introduction and with this presentation. It's kind of an unusual thing to be doing, this presentation. But in way of background, and as an appropriate lead into the presentation, the reason that I'm in Monterey at present is because we're taking forward a collaboration with CNS. And therefore, the purpose of this presentation in part is to kind of highlight what we have been doing at King's over the last few years, with a view of kind of building or identifying synergies with CNS activities. And I feel uncomfortable slightly because it means that we end up talking a lot about what we do, and you know, I'm a government guy, and I definitely don't feel comfortable talking about what I do most of the time. So I'm very grateful for the introduction. I'm very pleased to be here, and my thanks to Robert, Dr. Potter and others for hosting and for being willing to explore the collaboration with King's. As I go through the presentation, so I'm going to touch upon where Alpha sits within King's College London. I know we've got a very rich history of having students from CNS visit King's and vice versa, so by placing in its appropriate institutional situation, it will hopefully help to clarify what the Centre for Science and Security Studies is, which is where I sit, and where Alpha sits within that. And then I'm going to talk through three strands of Alpha's work: understanding illicit trade, seeking to counter illicit trade, and then strengthening international institutions. And what I'll be doing is mostly looking backwards as to what we've been doing for the last 3 years. I will, where relevant, also touch upon a few future activities. And at the very end, I'm going to throw out a few things that are kind of topical issues that I'm thinking about, that I think there's a need for work to be done on, that I kind of feel aren't being addressed fully at present. So to go into this then, Centre for Science and Security Studies, headed by Professor Wynne Bowen, who was a member of staff here, is that right, back in the 1990s, working on missile-related issues before he went off to work with UNSCOM and others. He now has, he set up the centre, he took over the Centre for Science and Security Studies in the early 2000s and has grown it to what it is today, focusing on a range of international security-esque issues, most of which are nuclear related, but we're also moving into the area of cyber and so on. A big interest of Professor Bowen moving forward relates to deterrence, with a view of kind of getting back into the thinking about strategic deterrence, which has kind of not been a particularly topical issue in the UK in the academic scene for a number of years, and I'm sure that's probably true in the US as well, in fact. When we actually look at projects within CSSS, the two primary areas, I guess, or the ones that kind of have most resource associated with them, related to nuclear security and non-proliferation, with the non-proliferation piece being the Alpha piece that I'll come on to talk about. In the area of nuclear security, King's have been doing a lot of work on train-the-trainer type activities in support of the Nuclear Security Summit, or under the auspices of the Nuclear Security Summit process. My colleague Chris Hobbs has also been developing a nuclear information security code of conduct, and that was also part of the Nuclear Security Summit process. And the nuclear security work will certainly continue. It's a multidisciplinary research centre. I've got a government technical type background. There are social scientists and so on. So bringing together a group of people who have diverse backgrounds. Goals of the centre very much focusing on the next generation of researchers. I think CSSS has had a great deal of success in that area. And when I look at kind of past PhD students, thankfully those who studied nuclear-esque issues are now mostly all gainfully employed in nuclear-esque subjects, which is promising. And we talk often now about the King's clan to rival the Monterey mafia, so we can bring them together at some point for war games or something else. And of course, research organisation, so very interested in impact, but also in terms of academic output too. Staffing, roughly 10 full-time individuals, lots of associated staff, lots of ex-government affiliates and so on. Also a lot of, on my project in particular, lots of part-time staff who have either an industry, government or academic background that we can then draw upon, and it's kind of then becomes a network which is kind of very flexible for responding to different projects. Funded from all sorts of places, core funding from the MacArthur Foundation. Alpha has funding from MacArthur, from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and also from various other governments and international organisations. Perhaps of interest to the students in the room, if there are any, King's has 2 master's programmes and a very popular PhD programme. We have something like 20 nuclear-esque PhD students currently in the centre, which is quite a sizable number actually, and as I said, we've got thankfully a good record of them staying in the field afterwards, and that's kind of one of the reasons that the MacArthur Foundation has continued to fund the centre to move in those directions. New focus in the last few years has very much related to professional development courses, in particular with regards to nuclear security, but also there's kind of a broader interest there, and UK universities, for a variety of reasons, are increasingly looking towards short courses in various forms as a way of kind of continuing to seek funding and grow and all that kind of stuff, so moving to a more business-esque climate. That was C++. Happy to answer any questions about that. The rest of the presentation very much focuses on Project Alpha, which is based in the Centre for Science and Security Studies, and which is the part that I look after. So Alpha was created back in 2011. I was seconded from government to lead Alpha, and it was created with a couple of staff, with this idea that the private sector could somehow play a bigger role in preventing proliferation. But that was a very kind of ill-defined concept, so I'll come on to talk about what we did to further define that, and then what we went on to do. At the time, it was UK government funding. We've since moved to a pretty diverse funding stream to reflect the wide range of activities that the project's involved with. Excuse me. I mentioned in my introduction the 3 strands that I'd be talking about: understanding illicit trade, countering illicit trade, and bolstering the international non-proliferation institutions. I'm going to take each of these in turn, and to move directly into the first strand. So to start with an observation, the overt state-to-state proliferation is very much in decline. We still see some cases of it, so the Syrian reactor is an example there. But by and large, when we talk about proliferation now, we're talking about something that's illicit, that's covert, and that involves non-state actors or actors that are acting without the expressed blessing of their host governments. And I'll come back to talk about that language, because that relates to the language of Resolution 1540, if anyone's familiar with the language of that resolution, which is a very strong instrument that we do a lot to work with and support. So we know that proliferation is continuing through illicit trade, but so what? So we want to understand that. So understanding illicit trade, we want case studies. So how is this happening in practice? And I'll come to present a couple of our case studies. It's happening in practice, but is it getting easier to stop, more difficult to stop? That then relates to the shape of the manufacturing base. So who in the world makes these technologies that are being sought for use in programs of concern? I've always found it quite bizarre in government that we never had a good feel for the manufacturing base of sensitive technologies. So you have export control regimes, but without necessarily having a good mapping of what it is that you're trying to control, who manufactures it, how is it sold. So we've been doing work to fill that void. One thing that I'll come back to talk about more is in relation to trends. So I'm going to present in the first instance specific pieces of work, specific case studies and so on. But of course the point of looking at specific case studies is mostly to inform a broader piece and a broader understanding, and that relates to trends. So I'll come back to talk about that. And as Robert alluded to in his introduction, so a big part of Alpha is putting this idea that the private sector can do more. So we do this research on understanding illicit trade, and then we have to put that into a format that business can in some way use. And I'll talk about some of what we've done there under the guise of proliferation briefs, but I'll also talk about it in the guise of the next section. So I'm going to present two case studies. Some of you I know have seen these and read these, but they're sexy and they're interesting, and there's kind of a lot of story, a lot of aspects that we know about these cases that we've not put out into the public domain. So I'll touch upon these. First case relates to MKS Instruments, which is based in Andover, Massachusetts. As this pointer working, not particularly well. I'll use the old-fashioned method. This gadget here is a pressure transducer. MKS Instruments is the kind of world's leading manufacturer of these things, have been from the 1970s, and have a very high percentage of the market share. I'll come on to talk about the recent competitors who have kind of come into the market, because there's some interesting aspects to that one. But the point is, so Iran, if you look at photographs of their cascades, have hundreds of these things. In the pellet fuel enrichment plant, it's pretty much one per machine. In the production plants, it's less than that, but it's one every couple of machines. And they'll, you know, the fact that they have this little red banner on the top indicate that it comes from MKS Instruments Andover. So then the question becomes, how on earth did they get so many of these things from a US firm, which has always been aware of the non-proliferation risks. So MKS are kind of famous in this area because they were originally listed as a supplier to Renko back in the 1970s, and associated with that has been a lot of proliferation awareness raising and so on. So the case study involves this chap Jamili, who's an Iranian. I'm going to say that most of this is purported, alleged, as there are in some cases trials pending in the US. So with that caveat, I'll talk through the narrative. So there's this chap Jamili who allegedly has this relationship with this chap Cheng, who's a Chinese national based in China. And they have a business relationship over a number of years where goods are purportedly supplied to Iran. Most of the goods would not in fact be subject to control. But at some point in 2007, Jamili asks Cheng to procure just around 1,000 of these pressure transducers, which is quite a significant number. Just to add a caveat to this case, so it's a significant number, but it's not enough to correlate to all the number that Iran had in their program. So there's other sources there too, and we can talk about that one as useful. So allegedly, Cheng then approaches MKS Shanghai Limited, which is the overseas distributor for MKS Instruments. And the sales manager there turns to him and says, well, this is fine, but actually we'd like you to go through this other individual who is unnamed in the indictment and so on. But this other individual has a relationship with MKS Shanghai Limited. And allegedly what happens then is that this other individual, through his own companies, acts as the source, acts as a point of sale for MKS, Shanghai staff, and then this unnamed individual then ships these goods onto Iran, and in several waves over a number of years. And he receives hundreds of these things. Allegedly, again, what happened with regards to the paperwork was that the names of the firms that were being used were often falsified. Turns out that MKS Shanghai Limited had in stock in China a number of these units that were assigned to specific customers. So some of those were and therefore the end user undertaking for export licensing purposes in the States had been granted on the provision that they'd be supplied to the named customers and so on. So there's falsification of the end user undertakings and the false submission of information to the US licensing authority for the purposes of making this happen. That said, MKS Instruments Limited in Andover, Massachusetts, no one has suggested that they were not compliant with US export controls, so they applied for licenses as was expected. And in effect, what we're talking about here is an insider threat issue, if the allegations are true. So a sales manager for MKS based in Shanghai is kind of deceiving the rest of the company, which is quite an interesting case. And so that was a case study, and we've published this one, and it's kind of a very interesting case. A few follow-ups to it. I'm going to jump into the slide slightly. A few follow-ups to it though. So what happens next? Well, the US somehow got wind of what was happening, and there is now an indictment issued for two of the individuals involved. And if you read it, they quote directly from some of the email exchanges. So in some way, they've got the correspondence related to this case. They invite the sales manager from MKS Shanghai to Boston. I've heard it was to undergo export licensing training, but I'm not quite sure if that was true. He steps off the plane at Logan Airport and is promptly arrested, and awaits trial. Was the latest I've heard on that one, although I've not checked up on it too recently. The other interesting part of this case is this chap Cheng. So Jamili was Iranian. He was dealing with this chap Cheng, Shihai Cheng. Back in February of this year, he flew through Heathrow and was promptly arrested as he waited for his connecting flight. And I was fortunate that I was able to go along to his extradition hearing because it was a US arrest warrant, and he's going to be probably sent off to the States before too long, again to undergo trial. And so it's very rare. So in this case, we wanted to understand the illicit trade. We've got email chains in the indictment. We've got at least two of the individuals allegedly associatedly involved in the case and so on. So it really gives us an opportunity to kind of understand what's going on. With regards to that, so the numbers are quite interesting here. So the overall value was $1.8 million, and we're talking about 100% markup on the market price of the goods, which kind of goes to show the potential profits involved. And when we're talking about an insider threat issue, and profits in this kind of magnitude, it's easy to see that it's difficult for a company to without kind of having a very systematic approach to root out that type of perverse motivation to behave in a way that's contrary to the company's interests. MKS have, however, taken a great deal of steps to kind of strengthen their system, and we are interested in these. We wanted to document these so that we could talk to other businesses about the MKS experience and what they've done about it. And so, again, part of our guidance for business, we published this document on the right-hand side here. But in effect, what MKS did was to move towards this controlled delivery model. And in effect, what they sought to do for their sensitive items was to bypass their distribution chain and go from the factory directly to the customer by stopping to use distributors, which is, from a kind of a business perspective, is quite an interesting, potentially difficult step. But we go back to the fact that MKS were the leading manufacturer of these things. It's not like there was the customers could simply switch to a different supplier. Again, all the customers are then visited by a person from headquarters who would have to sign off on the individual shipments and so on. And also they use a very significant agent whose reputation would be more valuable than the potential diversion of goods. And I'll tell you offline who that agent is, and there are other business interests if useful. Before we go on, so I mentioned that there were that MKS was a dominant supplier, but a few years ago another company or other companies brought out alternative products. And it's a very interesting case actually, because the technology that was introduced is based on an oxide as opposed to a ceramic as opposed to a metal pressure sensing element. And the point here is that the way that the Nuclear Suppliers Group controls on these instruments were written excluded this new technology. And so under the NSG Fundamental Review, which completed last year, there was a move to widen the control to encompass these new technologies. Fine. However, the NSG completed its review some time ago now, and in most countries the update to the control list has not yet been incorporated into the national controls, which is a bit worrying. More problematically, and I'll come back to talk about UN sanctions towards the end of the presentation. For now, let me say that there are UN sanctions in place that prohibit the export of certain technologies to Iran and North Korea, and by and large the drop on the lists of the Nuclear Suppliers Group and others. The slight kind of bureaucratically related issue that we have is that the sanctions on Iran are linked to a specific version of the NHG list, and it's not the most recent version. So we could end up in a slightly bizarre position where the versions of the lists don't prohibit the export to Iran of if we go back a couple of slides, of this thing here. And this, I put this photograph in for a very specific reason. This here is a calibration setup where they've got an MKS unit on one side and the rival technology on the other side, and they're kind of making sure the two are compatible as such. So that worries me, and there's obviously work that has to be done there to kind of sort out that problem. So that was the MKS case. One last kind of funny tale on this one. So MKS don't sell these through distributors and such now, but there's obviously still a lot out there from 30 or 40 years, second-hand units and so on. So I went onto eBay and found one for sale in China and proceeded to buy it. It wasn't FedEx, it was a Chinese carrier, but promptly it arrived 2 or 3 days later in a nice little box. It had in fact been stopped by customs. They stopped to highlight to me that I hadn't paid the appropriate amount of import tax, as opposed to checking if there was any form of proliferation sensitivity to it. There are lessons there somewhere, but perhaps not for the conversation today. Second case study then. Carol Lee, I'm sure most people are familiar with the story on this one. Chinese national who over the last 10 years or so is accused of very actively supporting the Iranian missile program through the provision of all sorts of materials, parts, technologies. And the US have been going after this guy for ages, sending démarches to China, designating him as an individual involved in proliferation, and most recently, a few months ago, seizing his assets. Seizing his assets in a very interesting way. So he doesn't set foot on US territory for quite obvious reasons. His funds were in Chinese as opposed to American banks. But the US, the way that the US financial sanctions are structured and have been kind of used in this case and others, they have an extraterritorial reach. So in this case, they're able to exert pressure onto the Chinese bank to freeze the assets of this chap. So it's a really interesting case and one that's not been fully documented. So we spent quite a lot of time writing a 50 or 60 page case study on this chap. I would commend it to anyone with an interest because it's got a lot of very new information on it. One of the things that I would highlight about it, we're particularly interested in his alleged use of front companies. So for a number of reasons. So we know that this chap has a lot of different companies. In US correspondence documents and so on, there's as many as 20 or 30 different companies potentially mentioned. One of the issues that we kind of spotted quite early on was actually when approaching the Chinese authorities, one of the challenges here is that the spellings were often slightly incorrect and the names were wrong and were a little bit out of date. So a process of consolidation resulted in these firms being identified as the ones that were actually in existence. So these were all registered companies in China associated with Carol Lee, or in fact associated with Carol Lee's business partners or family members. So for example, we've grounds to believe that his mother's name, his now deceased mother's name, was used to register one of these companies. He also has a business partner who in fact does travel in the US, who is kind of involved with the registration of several of these. Looking at this chart, you can see that a lot of these organisations do close down. There's a bit of a question there. Does that mean that there's been enforcement action taken? The Chinese government have said that they've been investigating this chap for years and never been able to bring him to justice. That's possible. My criticism of China here is that they've not been transparent as to what steps they have or have not taken. It's no good telling us to investigate. If they bring him to justice, fine. If there's no grounds for doing anything with him, if he's not committed any crimes, fine. But we need that level of transparency. What's interesting here is some of these firms, in fact, do continue to trade, and there are some pretty new additions to the list. One of them, and this is a firm that the name of the firm appears on sanctions, but the address doesn't. And my belief is that the US government weren't aware of what comes next, which is this. So this is Carol Lee's factory in China, which, as you can see, is a pretty substantial investment. It's set up with something like $7 million worth of funds, which is about the same as, or the holding company was set up with that level of funds, which is about the same amount of funds as the US seized a few months ago of his assets. So we're talking about a very wealthy and quite young individual actually, and he's doing well with the business. What's interesting about this is so on the website of this firm, they list their products, and it includes graphite that would be subject to control by NTCR. And that's interesting because there's been a lingering question of whether he's done anything that would be a breach of the law, Chinese law, or let's say UN sanctions. And it's a very difficult thing to prove without kind of investigating the specifics of the case. The point here is that we know that he's allegedly been involved in the supply of graphite from China to Iran. For use in missile applications. You've got a factory that he owns that makes graphite that's controlled by MTCR. There's at least strong enough grounds to investigate the potential that there is an express breach of UN sanctions. There are a few nuanced issues with this, as there always are, and again we try to work through these with regards to our work on China that I'll come back to talk about. But China ties its MTCR, its control list on missile technologies to the 2004 version of the MTCR list as opposed to an updated version. Why? Well, because they had asked to join MTCR back then and weren't allowed to, and out of protest they now don't update their list. That then leaves a lingering period where if there's updates, new technologies added to MTCR, they wouldn't automatically be incorporated in Chinese law. Fine. But then we hit this instance where you have UN sanctions, which are tied to a more recent version of the MTCR list. And again, that discrepancy on lists is kind of a theme that's interesting to explore. And there's more that I could talk about with regards to the Carol Lee. I could spend hours or weeks or days talking about it, and I'd be happy to kind of discuss it further in Q&A. This is just a naughty graph that I found on the internet, just a placeholder to remind me to talk about this. So we've looked at two specific cases, both of which involved China. We've got lots of these case studies. Some of the entities involved may well often be the same, they may well be different, but we need to understand where there are linkages. Because if we think back to the days of A.Q. Khan and his network, so any one government might have seen a very small part of the network, but it's only when you kind of put all these things together that you really see the kind of interlinkages. And in fact, so Jamili, who I mentioned in the first case study, he also features as the procurement agent, allegedly, as does Sheng in another case, which relates to bellows, which were allegedly destined for the Iranian enrichment program. Bellows, in this instance, there's a little bit of debate about it, but it's either for use in bellows sealed valves or potentially as decoupling units in pipe work. But anyway, so again, we look at these cases in isolation, and it's interesting to work through, and it kind of has interesting lessons. But we do have to kind of stand back and see the big picture. And my thinking is that this is something that we would have to do as a community, because no one organisation can see this whole big picture. I'll come on to talk about the role of governments and UN organisations in that. So that was case studies. The next side of this is to think about, so that's how goods get from the suppliers to the end users of concern. But who are the suppliers? How many firms make the things we care about? Where are they based? How is the market structured? Do they typically sell direct? Do they go through distributors? Do they match well with the specific HS codes, which are customs codes, and can allow us to more easily track their movements? So there's lots of really interesting questions there, and I'm going to kind of talk to a very specific case, and then I'll move on to general trends in the next one. So Iranian centrifuge moving towards having carbon fibre for the rotating parts. Why carbon fibre? Well, so some of the other work we did was to look at the mechanical properties of carbon fibre as opposed to alloys and rotors. You can easily get up to 4 times the velocity of aluminium if you use carbon fibre. And there's other things you can do that makes it a very attractive material. Velocity, the separative efficiency is velocity squared or cubed, or depending on how you figure it out. So speed is very important. Carbon fibre is good for that. Fine. Iran can't make carbon fibre. I was just having a look to see if I included the photograph. I didn't. A few years ago, there was a big press release from Iran saying our new carbon fibre production line. I took it to a carbon fibre industry expert and showed it to him, and he kind of started sniggering and laughing and saying, so they've got these reels on the end, they've got the carbon fibre production line, but that line didn't produce these reels. So it's kind of subterfuge to pretend that they were producing something when actually they weren't. Carbon fibre is hard, it's very hard to produce. In fact, it's so hard that worldwide there's only a handful of firms, less than 10, that actually make it. There's many who use it, and there's, so going back to the structure of the market, less than 10 firms use it, make it, thousands and thousands use it. So is there something that can be done with those 10, is then the question. I'll come back to talk about that. What's interesting here, moving on to some of the lessons that we've seen from doing a range of these manufacturing-based reports, often there is a very small primary manufacturing market. The supply base isn't spreading rapidly, but China, which has these 5-year strategic investment plans, is seeking actively to develop most of the technologies that we would care about. So less than 10 firms making carbon fibre commercially. China currently has about 20 firms which are seeking to manufacture carbon fibre, and it's effectively like a market force, so they're just throwing money at it. Lots of different companies taking different approaches. If they succeed, great, but those that don't succeed just get kind of closed down. They don't go forward, and we've seen some of that. In fact, that's interesting. There's an implication there somewhere for the future of controls. In general, China doesn't currently have the capability to manufacture most of what we care about. The approach that they're taking means that at some point soon they are going to be able to master all these technologies, and therefore it makes the process of engaging China particularly important. The other one is that supply chains are of course becoming more complex, so there continues to be a very small number of manufacturers, but they sell it through all sorts of different ways. The recession was particularly unhelpful in that regard. So carbon fibre, for example, is closely linked to the production rate of aircraft, and the number of aircraft being produced during the recession dipped quite substantially. That meant that there was excess carbon fibre on the market. It was then being sold through business-to-business websites such as Alibaba and other places that it would never normally be, but there was an excess supply, insufficient demand, and so therefore it gets out. So that's the kind of thing that it's useful to know and useful to think about. Sorry, I think I'm missing. Okay, sorry, the slide's in slightly the wrong place. So that's all very interesting stuff, but so what? Well, one of the things that we have to think about is how do we convey, what do we convey to business? Through Alpha, we do sector-specific events for different industries in the UK and elsewhere in China. And what we want to do, so we did an event for the composites industry. We had to be able to kind of pull together all that research and present it to industry in a way that they could do something useful with. So we do these proliferation briefs as one example. This is from a different sector. And so on. Fine. So that was understanding illicit trade. The next section that I'm going to move on to is countering illicit trade. And this is, much too aspirational for a humble university to possibly do. But I actually feel like there is good work that can be done in this area. So I'll talk briefly about the work we do in the UK and the approach we take to it more than the work that we do. Then I'll talk about the overseas bits and pieces, and I'll be quite quick with this. So key observation then. So there are, in many instances, a smaller number of firms that make things that we do care about. What's interesting though is whether it's for those technologies or if it's for the technologies we care about that have got a larger base, the primary market for them is often like the defence, nuclear, aerospace or government sectors. These tend to be strategic technologies, and strategic technologies tend to have been developed because they've got a high-end sexy application in aircraft or whatever it is. We know that firms in those sectors tend to be very well regulated. They tend to be very compliant because it goes with having government accreditation and so on. The question then becomes, is there a way of utilising that supply chain observation to prevent proliferation? So, we want to reach out to dozens, tens, hundreds of manufacturers and distributors. How do we do it? So one of the things that we have been pursuing is this idea of supply chain approaches. So if we can get the big the big defence firms of this world to stand up and say, we will only buy from you if you've got an export compliance program in place and you are compliant, then that will make firms compliant. We embody that in, slides are missing. Sorry. We embody that in our Partners Initiative, which I don't have a slide on here, but the Partners Initiative is based on a code of conduct that was drafted by Alpha in UK Business, or drafted by Kings in UK Business and submitted to the Nuclear Suppliers Group. Now appears on the website of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, although one of the NSG member countries didn't consent to it being released through the Nuclear Suppliers Group. There's a typical nuance there. And the Partners Initiative, the Code of Conduct, it has like 9 measures in it, and it's all the things that companies would have to do not to become involved in proliferation. So training, due diligence, and so on. And so we now have this as an initiative. We ask companies to sign up to it. We ask them to be partners and to demonstrate to other companies how they go about achieving or implementing the measures that we set up. That's slow progress. One of the challenges is governments actually. So BIS in the UK, the Export Licensing Organisation, I go to them and talk about the Partners Initiative, and they say, well, this is fine, but my job is to make sure companies are compliant, and you're saying that they should be doing more than compliance. I'm like, yes, of course I am. And that bureaucratic mindset is a real problem here, but it's one that we have to continue to plug away at to overcome, and not just in a national sense, in an international sense. To help with that, so in the UK we've been doing sector-specific outreach events. We produce a free e-learning module on export controls, which is this thing on the right-hand side. And the idea is to make it easier for companies to be compliant, to lower the hurdle associated with compliance. We're also working with the UK government departments to create an outreach strategy, primarily to overcome that bureaucratic mindset that I just mentioned of, is this my problem? And of course, yes, it is their problem, but they have to understand how their part of the picture fits into the overall scene, and therefore we're creating with them an outreach strategy that kind of appropriately assigns each department's responsibilities into the broader non-proliferation piece. And that's something that I think most governments, or all governments, should do. On the international side, we have a great interest in understanding how controls are being implemented elsewhere, and I'll come back to talk about that. Why? Well, so countries like India have been in isolation from the international marketplace for a long period of time. That's driven indigenization, so they now have of course, a complete nuclear fuel cycle, but also the capability to manufacture items for the complete nuclear fuel cycle. If India or another country like India wasn't implementing controls effectively, then we could really see the ramifications and impacts of that. And to give you a specific example, so there's a case related to a Turkish individual at present, from a couple of years ago in fact, where Iran, allegedly through this chap who was based in Turkey, approached lots of German firms for valves. It was all the valves that was required for the Iraq heavy water reactor. Is it the production plant or reactor? I can't quite remember. $7.7 million worth of value there, very significant. The valves that were going to be subject to export control because they have had radiation hardened actuators were in fact sourced from India. and they're sourced from India because, of course, India has experience and has developed a niche capability to manufacture valves that are belly sealed and have actuators that can work in a radioactive environment. So that speaks to the challenge. We do things like this paper, which is looking at export controls in specific countries to understand where are the gaps. We then try to fill those gaps or try to work with national authorities to fill some of those gaps. We've been doing a lot in China, doing industry outreach events in partnership with the Chinese authorities. We're currently working to create a Chinese e-learning module because in countries like China, the challenge you have is the scale of the challenge, the scale of the need. So, there's hundreds of thousands of individuals and companies that could trade in dual-use technologies. How on earth do you, as a government, get out to all of them? Well, we can't. So you need to think of novel and innovative ways to have the scale of impact that you desire. And we can talk more about China. It's useful. It continues to be the country that most illicit trade goes through. But not normally as a starting point, because as I said earlier, China generally lacks the capability to manufacture most of the strategic technologies that we would pursue in terms of stopping that. Just saying this when you're in the general sense. So my thinking is that the Chinese government has increasingly moved to upped its commitment to non-proliferation measures and increasingly moved to implement them on a practical level. The challenge is really the one of the private sector. It's very different from the defence side in China, where there's a very small number of firms that are licensed to manufacture weapons, and they're very easy to regulate. On dual-use technologies, there's hundreds and thousands of these organisations, and it's a very different regulatory challenge. And of course, even in all countries, in the US and the UK, there's lots of non-compliance. It exists. We have to recognise that and plan accordingly. Strand 3. So international institutions. We do a lot to support different international institutions. I'll touch on a couple of them, and I will be relatively brief. 1540, so I mentioned this in my opening remarks. It's a resolution that nominally is aimed at preventing non-state actor involvement in proliferation. It's got its origins in part as a counter-terrorism thing, as part as a counter-proliferation thing in response to the CAN network. And this is the 10th anniversary of the adoption of 1540. I think it's a very important resolution. I think it has the potential to be the foundation of the non-proliferation tool set because it's universally binding and it requires states to have export controls and to do a whole range of other things to prevent non-state actor involvement in proliferation. That thing about non-state actor involvement in proliferation, well, so you could therefore say that it's not about state proliferation. I would probably dispute that because as we've explored, most state proliferation relies on non-state actors. So therefore it is an instrument that has a direct effect in constraining state proliferation too. And what's really neat about it is it's possible to engage countries under the auspices of 1540. So back in February, the photo on the bottom left, we went off to India and held an event. This is the report from it on effective practices for the implementation of 1540. India. So India has always been very sceptical about supply side controls, and we now have them leading an effort on 1540, which is in effect a supply side control. Why? Well, because they see this in their interest for non-state actors not to become involved in proliferation. It's kind of a common ground that we can build upon. So it's a very important instrument. Unfortunately, it's also one I sense that isn't particularly well. It's not seen as being the key instrument in governments in most countries. So, with regards to capacity building and outreach, global partnership is often seen as the primary body. I'd say, well, fine, that's been the case in the past for good reasons. Global partnerships, was set up to deal with kind of the fallout of the collapse of the Soviet Union. We now have slight constraints with regards to what the global partnership can do in relation to Russia. Going forward, would that really be our primary instrument, or should we be thinking about how to use 1540 in a more effective way? And in fact, we have a book coming out on 1540, its origins, purpose, and its future direction. And I really do think that it's an instrument that we have to think more about, because it's a very powerful one. And I've got some specific ideas on how we go about that. The challenge with 1540 is that we don't have any good feel for how it's being implemented. National authorities, governments are required to submit implementation reports. They were originally very bad. They've been improving. A lot of people focus on the fact that there's still some 20 odd countries that haven't submitted reports, and think that if those could be encouraged to submit reports, then we then know the answer to the question of how is 1540 being implemented. Nonsense, because most of these reports, they're all variable. Some states have a 2-page report, others have a 50-page report. In parallel to that, the 1540 Committee and its group of experts maintains country matrices, or maintained or created, I should say, country matrices that looked at implementation of 1540 in different countries. Sadly, they've not been updated since 2010, or maybe even before that in some cases. And so frankly, I just don't think we've got any good sense of how 1540 is being implemented. If we don't know this, my question is, how can we do effective capacity building? How do we prioritise? And I suggest that we probably can't. So therefore, there's a need to think about how to figure out how 1540 is being implemented. At King's, what we decided to do was to do something that I thought would annoy my colleagues in the UN a great deal, and I'm sure it will do, which is to see if there's a role for civil society in this. So we developed this tool that's on the page here as a kind of a test bed as a concept, with the idea of trying to crowdsource 1540 implementation reports or matrices. So the idea is that any party, be it government, be it academia, be it civil society, can go into the Afghan report or to a report of a specific country, and if they know that there is a law, that there's a clause, there is a measure that's been implemented in that country and it's not reflected in the report, they could make that suggestion, and then it goes off to some approving authority for consideration. Why did I say that I know this would annoy my colleagues in the UN? Well, certain countries in the Security Council don't feel comfortable with civil society having a role in 1540 for reasons which are quite strange. I mean, there's a bit of historic background to that, but it means that the 1540 is seen as it's all about the state. It's not about civil society. My thinking is that civil society could help out greatly on this, and this is one way. There's probably other ways that civil society can be more engaged. But if we did something like this, we'd be able to identify priorities and then hopefully work through those priorities with regards to implementation activities afterwards. I was very lucky and fortunate and privileged to be invited to present this report to the 1540 Committee on Monday of this week. And that's important actually, because civil society has never before interacted with the 1540 Committee. No one's ever been asked to speak from civil society to the committee before. And that thing about the committee not seeing civil society as having a role, we have to kind of plug away at that and try to break down that barrier slowly. So I probably overstretched my welcome slightly, because I did talk about this tool in passing. And I await to see what the feedback looks like from that.